You already know why you overthink. You have read about it, talked about it, probably explained it to someone else with surprising clarity. You understand that your brain is searching for certainty in an uncertain situation. You know that running the same thought on a loop does not actually solve anything. You might even know the precise moment in your life when the habit took hold. And yet, tonight, or tomorrow, or sometime in the next week, you will lie awake doing it anyway. So what is the point of understanding? If insight into your own mind cannot stop you from repeating the very behavior you have diagnosed, what is it actually good for? That question deserves a serious answer, not a reassuring one, a real one. The relationship between understanding yourself and actually changing is one of the most misunderstood ideas in both psychology and popular self-help culture. Insight is routinely sold as the destination. Understand the root cause, the logic goes, and the symptom will dissolve. But that is rarely how the mind works. Insight is not a solution. It is more like a door. And a door, no matter how clearly you can see it, does not walk you through itself. Start with what overthinking actually is. The word itself is imprecise, which is part of the problem. What most people mean when they say they overthink is something closer to what psychologists call rumination. Rumination is repetitive, passive, and focused almost entirely on problems, their causes, and their possible consequences. It is not the same as planning, which moves forward. It is not the same as reflection, which tends to resolve and settle. Rumination circles, it revisits, it replays, and crucially, research by Susan Nolen-Hoeksema at Yale, who spent much of her career studying this pattern, consistently showed that rumination does not reduce distress, it amplifies it. The more you engage with a thought in that circular churning way, the more distress the thought generates. Why does the mind do it at all then? The honest answer is that your brain does not always distinguish between useful thinking and useless thinking when it is under threat. Your default mode network, which is the brain system most active when your mind is not focused on an immediate task, generates thought continuously. It processes social situations, imagines future scenarios, and reviews past events. In moderate doses, this is useful. It prepares you. It helps you learn from mistakes. It anticipates problems before they arrive. But when anxiety or uncertainty is high, this system can become caught in a loop. It keeps returning to the unresolved situation because, at a very basic level, it has not received a signal that the threat is over. Understanding this is genuinely useful. When you can name what is happening, something important shifts. The psychologist Dan Siegel describes this using the phrase, "name it to tame it." When you can identify a mental state with some precision, the intensity of that state tends to reduce. This is not merely a motivational idea. Studies using neural imaging have shown that labeling an emotional experience with accurate language reduces activity in the amygdala, which is the part of the brain most involved in threat responses. Naming your experience does not eliminate it, but it appears to reduce the level of alarm your nervous system is generating. This is one of the genuinely valuable things insight offers. It interrupts the automatic nature of the response. For most of your life, patterns like overthinking operate below conscious attention. They run on their own. Naming them creates a moment of separation between the experience and your reaction to it. That gap is small, but it is real, and it is the gap in which something different can happen. There is another thing insight provides that is often overlooked. It reduces shame. A significant portion of the suffering that accompanies overthinking does not come from the overthinking itself. It comes from the judgment layered on top of it. Why can I not just stop? What is wrong with me? Why can everyone else manage this? This secondary layer of self-criticism often does more damage than the original pattern. Understanding that overthinking is not a character flaw, not a sign of weakness, and not something you invented for yourself can quietly dissolve some of that shame. And shame, research consistently suggests, is one of the conditions most likely to maintain and intensify the very behaviors it attaches to. The psychologist Paul Gilbert, whose work on compassion-focused therapy draws from evolutionary psychology, argues that shame activates a threat system in the brain that makes change considerably harder rather than easier. Reducing shame is not a soft outcome. It is a functional precondition for anything to shift. But here is where the misunderstanding begins. Insight removes a specific kind of obstacle. It clears certain conditions that prevent change from being possible. What it cannot do is substitute for the change itself. Think of it this way. You might fully understand that you eat when you are not hungry because food became associated with comfort during a period of stress early in your life. That understanding is accurate. It is useful. It may even be the result of long and difficult therapeutic work. But understanding why the habit formed does not dissolve the neural pathway that connects stress to the urge. Those pathways are changed through practice, through repetition, through building alternative responses over time. Knowing and doing are handled differently by the brain. Declarative knowledge, which is the kind you gain from reading, reflecting, or talking about yourself, lives largely in conscious awareness. But habits, emotional responses, and automatic behaviors are encoded much more deeply. They belong to procedural and emotional memory systems that do not change simply because conscious awareness has arrived. This is the gap between knowing and being. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus made a version of this argument almost 2,000 years ago. He taught that philosophy was not an intellectual exercise, but a daily practice. Knowing that some things are outside your control and actually living as though that is true are two completely different disciplines. Marcus Aurelius, who studied Stoic philosophy deeply and returned to its principles in his private journals throughout his life, wrote about this not as someone who had mastered the practice, but as someone who was still working at it. The journals suggest that even a person who understood the principles with great sophistication had to return to them each morning and apply them deliberately. Understanding was the beginning. Practice was the method. This is the honest picture of what insight actually offers. It is necessary, it is not sufficient. What does this mean for overthinking specifically? Once you understand that rumination is a threat response rather than a solution to a problem, several things become possible that were not possible before. You can recognize it more quickly when it begins. You can give it a name, which reduces its intensity slightly. You can understand that engaging with the looping thought more thoroughly is unlikely to resolve it. You can decide to interrupt the loop rather than follow it. You can practice redirecting your attention gently and repeatedly towards something that requires your present focus. Not because forcing your mind somewhere else is easy, but because you now understand that the loop is not productive, and that gives you a different relationship to it. None of this happens once, it happens many times. Each time you catch the loop beginning and choose a different response, you are doing the actual work. That work is fundamentally different from the insight that made it visible. The insight told you what you were doing and why. The practice is what builds the alternative. The metacognitive therapy developed by Adrian Wells at the University of Manchester offers a particularly useful shift here. Traditional approaches often focus on examining the content of anxious or ruminative thoughts. Wells argued that what matters more is your relationship to the thinking process itself. Specifically, he identified what he called positive metacognitive beliefs about rumination. These are beliefs such as, overthinking helps me prepare, or going over this will help me find an answer, or if I think about this enough, I will feel ready. These beliefs are what keep the loop running. Insight into these beliefs, he found, was a useful step, but the therapeutic work involved practicing different responses to the urge to ruminate, not just understanding that the urge existed. This is a meaningful distinction. It suggests that the most useful kind of insight is not just why you do something, but insight into the beliefs and assumptions that maintain the behavior. That level of understanding gets closer to the mechanics of change, but it still requires practice to take effect. There is a useful concept in Buddhist psychology here as well. The tradition makes a clear distinction between intellectual understanding and what it sometimes calls direct knowing or embodied understanding. You might understand impermanence conceptually. You might be able to explain it clearly. But the tradition suggests that genuine realization of impermanence, the kind that changes how you live, is different in quality from intellectual grasp. It is something arrived at through practice, through sitting with experience directly, through repeated return to the same truth across different circumstances. The insight is the map. The practice is the walk. This is not discouraging. It is clarifying. It tells you where you actually are when you finish a book about anxiety or when a therapy session leaves you feeling like something suddenly makes sense. You are at the door. The understanding is real. The usefulness is real. What lies ahead is the less glamorous, less immediately satisfying work of returning to the same principles across your ordinary moments of life. And those moments are specifically when you are tired, stressed, uncertain, and not in the mood to practice anything. The good news is that understanding genuinely does make the practice easier. Not instant, easier. Because you have a clearer picture of what you are doing when you interrupt the loop. You are not simply trying to distract yourself. You are deliberately declining to engage a system that you now understand will not deliver what it promises. That kind of informed action has a different quality. It is done with some small amount of self-compassion rather than frustration, because you understand that the loop is not your fault. It is done with more consistency, because you are not waiting for the urge to disappear before you redirect. And over time, consistent practice does change the neural pattern. The urge becomes less frequent. The loop becomes easier to step out of. This is where understanding and practice meet. You began tonight believing that understanding yourself should fix you. Perhaps you have carried that belief for a long time. Perhaps it's why reading has sometimes left you feeling quietly disappointed, as though knowing the right things about yourself should be enough. But insight was never meant to be the end of the process. It was always the beginning, the part of the process that makes the harder parts possible. The part that gives you enough clarity to take the next step, and then the next, and then the one after that. Understanding opens the door. You still have to walk through it every single day.